Hello and welcome back to the Movie Memo Recaps. Today we are going to recap a 2021 movie titled The Marksman. Please be advised that there will be spoilers ahead. The story unfolds in Mexico with a boy named Miguel. Miguel stays with his mother, Rosa, while his father died when he was a baby. One day, while Rosa was cooking at home, she suddenly got a call from her cousin, Carlos. He informs Rosa that a drug cartel is hunting him after to king off with their large sum of money. Therefore, he asked her to take the stolen money and quickly get out of Mexico. Carlos was eventually caught by the drug cartel led by a man named Mauricio. Mauricio finds that Carlos has just called Rosa when he checks his cell phone, thinking that Carlos gave the cartel money to Rosa. Mauricio immediately plans to hunt her down. As for Carlos himself, he was killed by Mauricio's men after being beaten. At the American-Mexico border, specifically in the Arizona area, a retired Marine named Jim Hansen is on duty to guard the border from illegal immigrants. While watching his cattle, Jim saw some immigrants who were quietly about to cross. He immediately reported his discovery to other officers before following the immigrants. After a while, he found a Mexican man with a wound on his leg. The man was abandoned by his group because the wound on his leg made him unable to walk. Jim reported it again to another officer over the radio before heading home. Arriving at the house, Jim had a bank officer who wanted to collect debts. Jim turned out to have a lot of debt because he had to fund the cost of his late wife's cancer surgery. Worse yet, his house will be confiscated if he cannot pay the debt. He had no money now, so he had to beg the debt collector to give him a few extra weeks to pay off his debt. In the afternoon, Jim went to a cattle farmer to sell some of his cows. But unfortunately, the cattle farmer offered his cow at a low price. Jim was confused because even though all his cows were sold, he still lacked the money to cover his debts. That evening, Jim went to the bar to calm his mind for a moment. There he meets his stepdaughter, Sarah, who is a border police officer. Jim then told her the debt problem that could cause him to lose his house. That night Jim drank so much that Sarah had to drive him home. The next day at the Mexican-American border, Rosa and Miguel are being hunted by a cartel. They were trying to enter America through a hole in the iron fence, and that's when they met Jim, who happened to be passing by. Rosa, who is now an illegal immigrant, pleads with Jim not to report her and Miguel to the border headquarters. But not long after, Mauricio and his gang arrived, and he immediately asked Jim to hand over Rosa and Miguel. Realizing that Rosa and Miguel's lives are in danger, Jim finally chooses to protect them. That obviously irritated Mauricio, and inevitably a gunfight ensued between Jim and the cartel. Jim manages to shoot one of Mauricio's men with his rifle before fleeing with Rosa and Miguel in a pickup. But Mauricio didn't want to let them run away. He tried to catch up to Jim, but in the end, Jim still managed to escape. After losing his quarry, Mauricio is even more furious when he learns that his brother, who Jim shot, has died. From here, Mauricio began to hold a grudge against Jim Hansen. On the other hand, Jim discovers that Rosa has been shot. The gunshot wound was serious enough to put her life in danger. As if realizing that her life was on the line, Rosa then gave Jim a bag and her family's address in Chicago, begging him to take Miguel to his grandmother. Having said it all, Rosa breathed her last. But that evening, when the medical and police officers arrived at the crime scene, Sarah told Jim that Miguel would be taken to the police station to be handed over to his family. The next day at the border office, Jim, accompanied by his dog, Jackson, saw a car belonging to a drug cartel in the parking lot, but he didn't seem too bothered by it. After that, Jim opened the bag Rosa gave him and found that it contained a large amount of money. Given that he was in debt, Jim immediately stepped on the gas to the bank to pay off all his debts. But when he saw Rosa's bloodstain on the bag, his sense of indifference began to crumble. He remembered that he was given the responsibility of looking after Miguel. And so, he turned back towards the border office. There, Jim finds that Miguel will be handed over to his family, who are waiting outside. But he soon knew that the family in question was Mauricio. So, when the office clerk was busy on the phone, Jim immediately went to Miguel and took him away secretly. Meanwhile, in the parking lot, Mauricio watches Jim leave with Miguel. He decided to enter American territory to kill them and get his money back. Moments later, Jim had returned home to retrieve some of his clothes and weapons. Then he went straight with Miguel to Chicago. At the same time, Mauricio and his group began to enter the American border. The police who guard the border seemed to know very well the atrocities of the Mexican drug cartels. Frightened, he allowed Mauricio and his gang to enter America easily. After that, Mauricio went straight to Jim's house. He goes into the house and finds Jim's credit card documents and a Marine Award badge, indicating that Jim is no ordinary person. Mauricio then took the badge before setting Jim's house on fire. Mauricio decides to meet a cartel member in America to track down Jim's credit card information. On the other hand, Jim was stopped at a gas station to refuel and buy a map to guide his trip to Chicago. Unfortunately, he didn't realize that Mauricio had managed to track him down through the credit card he used at the gas station. Mauricio and his gang headed straight for the gas station without wasting any time. Mauricio asked the shop assistant where Jim was going when they got there. But the shop assistant didn't know, and she also objected to Mauricio checking the CCTV footage. Annoyed at her behavior, Mauricio finally kills her so he can check the footage. From the camera footage, it can be seen that Jim is going east. Meanwhile, Jim was stopped by the police, asking him to show Jim his driver's license and identity card. Jim told the truth that he carried a firearm and an official certificate of ownership. But instead, the police wanted to confiscate his gun. He also wanted to talk to Miguel. Reluctantly, Jim followed the officer into his car. But it didn't take long for Jim to realize the cop was calling someone on the phone. He didn't speak to Miguel at all. Suspicious, Jim finally confronted the cop, and his suspicions were confirmed. The cartel has paid the police to find Miguel. Jim then beats the policeman without giving him a chance, knocking him unconscious. After that, Jim tells Miguel to hide before the cartels arrive. And sure enough, not long after, Mauricio came and interrogated the cop about the whereabouts of Jim and Miguel. But the cop didn't know because they left when he was unconscious. Hearing that, Mauricio was furious and immediately shot the policeman. Unfortunately, Mauricio found Jim's map before he left and took it. Now having no guns, Jim decided to go to the gun shop and buy a shotgun, his favorite weapon type. That night, Jim and Miguel stay at a motel and fall asleep immediately. Around 2 a.m., Jim woke up from his sleep and decided to go out to enjoy the night with Jackson. But as he had just left the room, he saw Mauricio and his group in the hotel reception room. Jim immediately woke Miguel and called the police to tell them that there was a robbery at the motel. After that, he took Miguel away into the bushes. Not long after, Mauricio and his group broke into Jim's room and found him not there. They search for him around the hotel before an angry Mauricio screams and vows to kill Jim. After Mauricio leaves, Jim tells Miguel to get in the car while he returns to the hotel to look for Jackson. But the timing wasn't right because Jim found Jackson barking at Mauricio. And the dog was shot dead in front of Jim's eyes, making his heart shatter. The following day, Jim and Miguel buried Jackson on the farm. After that, they visited a church where Miguel wanted to pray for his dead mother. The priest who led the prayer then approached Jim and asked if Miguel was his grandson. Jim answered honestly, saying that he was trusted by someone to look after Miguel and had no relation to him at all. After that, Jim called Sarah, demanding that Jim return Miguel to the police. But he refused because he was determined to take Miguel to his family in Chicago. They then resumed their journey, while on the other hand, the cartel was at a loss as to what to do to catch Jim. But at that moment, Mauricio and his gang found clues from Jim's map. The map shows the city of Chicago, which Miguel had previously marked with a red marker. Mauricio finally knew where Jim was going and immediately called a cartel in Chicago to intercept Jim on the freeway. Exhausted from the journey, Jim and Miguel rest under the bridge while lighting a fire to warm themselves. They even burned the cartel's money to keep the fire burning. They continued their journey and finally arrived in the Chicago area the following day. But while crossing the highway, Jim saw a cartel group watching him on the flyover. He realized that he was under siege, and so he chose to continue his journey toward the countryside to escape danger. But in the end, Mauricio and his men know where Jim is. They immediately chased and intercepted him from the front. Fortunately, Jim once again managed to dodge and drove Mauricio's car into the bushes. Jim immediately stepped on the gas away from Mauricio, while Mauricio and his men were forced to turn around to chase him. As Jim made his way down the slope, he chose to stop to shoot the pursuers' cars with his rifle. Jim, who is a former Marine sniper, manages to shoot Mauricio's driver, sending his car overturning onto the side of the road. Mauricio and the two remaining members then got out of the car. On the other hand, Jim immediately took Miguel to safety. They hid in a fodder shed not far from the scene. It was there that Jim then aimed at the enemy from behind the window. With accurate precision, he managed to kill one of Mauricio's men. Now there are only two left. Next, Jim asks Miguel to fire a gun from inside the warehouse as a diversion. He then went to the side of the warehouse to aim at Mauricio's men. The plan was successful, now only Mauricio is left. But unexpectedly, Mauricio managed to sneak into the warehouse and catch Miguel. Then he pointed a gun at Miguel in Jim's presence, forcing him to put down his gun. The cunning Mauricio then forces Miguel to shoot Jim. But as it turned out, Miguel was smarter. He managed to empty the cartridges before the gun went off, giving Jim a chance to lunge at Mauricio. And then, a fight between the two ensued. Seeing their fight, Miguel wants to help Jim. He then took his gun and pointed it at Mauricio. But instead of begging for mercy, Mauricio challenges Miguel to fire a bullet at him. Jim certainly didn't want Miguel to be a murderer, and so he immediately grabbed the gun and shot Mauricio. After that, Jim gave Mauricio two choices: die by his hands or end his own life. Mauricio chose the second option. With their pursuers now dead, Jim and Miguel continued their journey until they arrived at the address Rosa had given them. Jim told Miguel to knock on the door, and when the door opened, he was greeted by his aunt and grandmother. He then looked back again, but Jim was gone. At the end of the film, Jim staggers up the bus. Then he sat in the passenger seat, clutching his stomach, which had been stabbed in the fight with Mauricio. Realizing that he was seriously injured, he slowly closed his eyes and leaned back. Thanks for watching. If you are new, don't forget to subscribe for more of these recaps. Until next time, have a nice day.